Hi, humans.
Hey, everybody.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you? Thank you for replying. Happy to see most of you here because it's dark out there. So
You
happy to see
us.
everybody.
So we're going to talk about family,
We're going to talk about family.
and we're going to talk about writing about family.
Oh boy.
Nobody throws a parade for that either.
No.
I mean,
don't
not our
think so.
families.
No.
Who wants
So
to start?
we thought we'd do a brief reading from some books and then talk about the challenges of writing about family. Is that correct? Why are you guys looking at me? Am I first? I guess
The
I'm
floor is
first. Hi, you
yours.
guys. My name's Andre. I've got a new book out called Ghost Dogs on Killers and Kin, and it's a collection of essays from over, 30 years of writing essays. And I'm going to read just 4 minutes from an essay called The Door, and it's about my wife and I deciding to have our first child and then almost losing that first child to a birth defect that he's okay. He's 32 and out in LA, so he's not okay now, but he's 32. And I'm just going to read a short passage. So my wife, Fontaine, has just told me she's ready to go off the pill. A few days after she told me this, I drove to, let me just tell you, we were poor. I grew up poor. She grew up poor. She's a dancer. I'm a writer. She upholsters furniture and teaches dance. I do carpentry and teach classes, and we're broke. But it's all we'd ever known. A few days after she told me this, I drove to my father's place 9 miles east. He lived alone in a small house on a hill overlooking a 2-lane road and the rise of a grassy slope, its ridge a thick stand of maple trees. It was late afternoon, and I knew he'd be finished with his day's writing and working out exercises he did with dumbbells from his wheelchair. He met me at the door. His hair was wet, and he was naked, a towel draped over his crotch and right stump. He was 56 years old and had wide shoulders and a deep chest, and he was smiling, his eyes lit with love for me. Hey, man. He held up his arms. I leaned down and hugged him. He smelled like soap, clean hair, and skin. Soon he was dressed, and we were out on his back deck. The sun was low over the ridge of maples, their branches still bare. It was cold, and I was wearing my leather jacket, but my father sat there in a short-sleeved shirt and sweatpants, the empty right leg of which he tied around his stump with a red bandana. He was lighting a cigarette with his Zippo, one hand cupped around the flame. The night before, I'd called him and asked if I could stop by just before supper. I had to ask him a question. He said, "Yeah, man, I'm here." This was new, my going to him to ask for any advice. It was my mother who raised us 4 kids, moving us from one cheap rented house in one mill town after another. When we saw our father, it was for 2 hours on a Sunday when he'd pick us up and drive us to church or take us out to a movie or a restaurant he could barely afford. There was the feeling he was relaxing with us, that we, his kids, were part of his recreation, and there was also the feeling that he was doing the best he could, and if we were to ask for any more than that, he wouldn't be happy. But that was years ago. Since then, he'd married and divorced 2 more times, and now he had 2 daughters with his 3rd wife, who was a year older than I was. She and my half-sisters lived 10 miles south, and he primarily saw them on weekends, the way he used to see us. Ever since I was old enough to sit in a bar with him, my father and I had had the easy rapport of drinking buddies. We sipped and talked about whatever came up, lifting weights, a good book, politics, and women, and we might tell each other a few dirty jokes. But I don't remember him ever asking me what I might want to do with my time on this planet. Once at a party at his house when he still had legs, I overheard him tell a friend of his, "I never tell my kids what to do with their lives." This, in many ways, was fine with me. I seem to prefer to learn everything on my own the hard way anyway, and I rarely, if ever, sought out teachers. "What's on your mind, man?" "Fontaine wants a baby." "Of course she does. But isn't it irresponsible to have one when you're as broke as we are?" My father was looking over the railing out at the trees and sky. He took a drag from his cigarette and shook his head. He told me that lack of money will always be a problem for most people, but that shouldn't stop anyone. "I just believe, son, when the woman wants a baby, then that's it. It's time to have that baby." I found myself agreeing, nodding. Besides, all that shit work you have to do when you know it's for diapers and food for your child and makes all work holy. Holy. This was one of my father's words. He was a Catholic and I was not. He believed there was a God who loved him. I did not. He believed he was being watched over, while I felt strongly that I was entirely alone, and the only good that would ever come to me would have to come from my own hard work and occasional good luck. Still, driving away from my thrice-divorced father's house, I felt better, for I believed that if my wife wanted a baby, then that should be that. Women only had limited time to get this done, and who was I to say she could not? Thank you. I'll just say one sentence and pass it on. The reason I read that short moment is I was so happy writing an essay where I could write about my father in a positive way, because when I wrote my memoir, Townie, that came out a few years ago, I was consciously aware in the writing that, as I went back in the shards of my own memory, that my father's daily absence in our lives became a predominant presence in the book, and I didn't want it to be there, but it was. Thank you.
Beautiful, Andre.
Thank you.
So I'm going to read the very beginning, just a few minutes, from my most recent novel, Signal Fires, because it is about a family. It is about what we do to each other and for each other in the name of love, and it's about the keeping of a secret, and this is where it starts. August 27th, 1985. Sarah and Theo. And it's nothing, really, or might be nothing, or ought to be nothing, as he leans his head forward to press the tip of his cigarette to the car's lighter. It sizzles on contact, a sound particular to its brief moment in history, when cars have lighters and otherwise sensible 15-year-olds choke down Marlboro Reds and drive their mother's Buicks without so much as a learner's permit. There's a girl he wants to impress. Her name is Misty Zimmerman. And if she lives through this night, she'll grow up to be a magazine editor, or a high school teacher, or a defense lawyer. She will be the mother of 3 or remain childless. She will die young of ovarian cancer or live to know her great-grandchildren. But these are only a few possible arcs to a life, a handful of shooting stars in the night sky. Change one thing and everything changes. A tremor here sets off an earthquake there, a fault line deepens, a wire gets tripped. His foot on the gas. He doesn't really know what he's doing, but that won't stop him. He's all jacked up, just like a 15-year-old boy. He has something to prove, to himself, to Misty, to his sister. It's as if he's following a script written in Braille, his fingers running across code he doesn't understand. Theo, slow down. That's his sister Sarah from the back seat. Misty's riding shotgun. It was Sarah who tossed him the keys to their mom's car. Sarah, age 17. After this night, she will become unknowable to him. The summer sky is a veil thrown over the moon and stars. The streets are quiet. The good people of Avalon long since tucked in for the night. Their own parents are asleep in their queen-sized bed under the plaid afghan knitted by one of his father's patients. His mom is a deep sleeper, but his dad has been trained by a lifetime as a doctor to bolt awake at the slightest provocation. He is always ready. The teenagers aren't looking for trouble. They're good kids. Everyone would say so. But they're bored. It's the end of summer. School will resume next week. Sarah's going into her senior year, after which she'll be gone. She's a superstar, his sister. Varsity this, honors that, bristling with potential. Theo has 3 years left, and he's barely made a mark. He's a chubby kid whose default is silence and shame. He blushes easily. He can feel his cheeks redden as he holds the lighter and inhales, hears the sizzle, draws smoke deep into his lungs. His father, a pulmonary surgeon, would kill him. Maybe that's why Sarah threw him the keys. Maybe she's trying to help, to get him to act, goddammit, to take a risk. Better to be bad than to be nothing. Misty Zimmerman is just a girl along for the ride. It was Sarah who asked her to come. Sarah doing for Theo what Theo cannot do for himself. Change one thing and everything changes. The Buick speeds down Poplar Street. Misty stretches and yawns in the passenger seat. Theo turns left, then right. He's getting the hang of this. He flicks the directional, then heads onto the parkway. As they pass the mall, he looks to see if Burger King is still open. "Watch it," Sarah yells. He swerves back into his lane, heart racing. He almost hit the guardrail. He gets off the parkway at the next exit and eases up on the gas. This was maybe a bad idea. He wants to go home. He also wants another cigarette. "Pull over," Sarah says. "I'll drive." Theo looks for a good spot to stop. He has no idea how to park. Sarah's right. This is stupid. "Actually, no, forget it. I shouldn't," she says. They're almost home. It's like a song in his head. Almost home, almost home, almost home. Just a few blocks to go. They pass the Heller's house, the Chertoffs. As he leans forward, the lighter slips through Theo's fingers and drops into his open shirt collar. He lets out a yelp and tries to grab it, which only makes matters worse. He arches his back to shake the burning metal thing loose, but it's wedged between his shorts and his belly. The smell of singed flesh. A perfect, shiny half moon will remain. Years from now, when a lover traces the scar on his stomach and asks how he got it, he will roll away. But now their futures shoot like gamma rays from the moving car. 3 high school students. What if Sarah had gone out with her friends instead that night? What if Misty had begged off? What if Theo had succumbed to his usual way of being and fixed himself a salami sandwich with lots of mustard and taken it with him to bed? The wheels spin. The screams of teenagers in the night. Theo knows stop, Jesus, fuck, help, God, and there is no screech of brakes, nothing to blunt the impact. A concussion of metal and an ancient oak, the sound of 2 worlds colliding. The fender and right side of the Buick crumple like it's a toy and this is all make-believe. Upstairs, on the 2nd floor of Benjamin and Mimi Wilf's home, a light blinks on. A window opens. Ben Wilf stares down at the scene below for a fraction of a second. By the time he's made it to the front door, his daughter Sarah is standing before him. Thank God, thank God, thank God. Her t-shirt and her face splattered with blood. Theo is on all fours on the ground. He seems to be in one piece. Thank God, thank God, thank God. But then there's a girl in the car, Dad. I'm going to stop there. Oof. Yeah.
So everyone brought their A game. So I just want to say first, I'm honored to be on the same stage with Andre and Dani. These are incredibly generous writers. And if you know some writers, it's like, well, yeah, like, sure, some writers are generous, some writers less so, but really extraordinary people. So I'm really just kind of happy to be here on this stage and here in Key West. If you have the little yellow booklet, it kind of gives like the brief sort of biographical sketch about me, which is also from my memoir called Take This Man. I was originally born Brando Kelly Ulloa. My biological father was a Mexican-American. My mother essentially chased him away when I was 3 years old and then decided to reinvent us as American Indians. So I didn't know that I wasn't an American Indian until I was about 12 or 13 years old. And once I discovered that, she encouraged me to continue to live as an American Indian for many years because she had reinvented herself as an American Indian as well. She was born Maria Teresa Banaga and became Running Deer Skyhorse, and I don't even have to take a survey here. It's like if you could choose to be Maria or Running Deer, I know exactly how many people would raise their hand and say, oh, Running Deer, that sounds fantastic. So I was thinking about what I could read here, and there's a lot of scenes, there's a lot of interesting sort of detours in this book. I had 5 stepfathers. My mother suffered from borderline personality disorder. My mother was also a phone sex operator, but also I feel like it's kind of a PG audience, so I'm not going to get into that, but it's in the book. But I thought that thinking about the theme of family, my mother had a very, very specific definition of what the word family meant to her. So I'm going to read a scene that happened when I was about 12 or 13 years old. And if you're wondering, wow, how does he remember something from like, years and years ago? Let's just say that when you have a mother that has mental health issues, it's your job to remember a lot of things. It was sometime during my last year of elementary school that I learned that Paul Skyhorse Johnson was not my real father. Inside a faux oak dresser in my mother's bedroom were colorful binders of photographs glued onto pages of what felt like sticky flypaper, covered with a transparent plastic that, when peeled back, made an anxious shh. It was the right sound. There were secrets here. How did you meet my dad? I asked. There were no photos of my mother and Paul together. I was a paralegal, my mother said, and met him at an American Indian Movement community meeting, she said. Where? I asked. Downtown, at the Indian Center. I thought about that. Later, I asked, why are there no photos of you two together? There weren't cameras on the reservation where we met, my mother said. I thought about that. Later, I said, I thought you met Paul at the Indian Center. Pictures steal an Indian's soul, my mother said. I thought about that. Later still, I said, but here is a picture of Paul alone. He had to give his soul to me to keep, my mother said. He was going off to Wounded Knee to fight and didn't want the white man to have it if he was captured. I really thought about that. Then I asked, why would he go to Wounded Knee if you were pregnant? What are you asking me, Brando? Why did Paul leave us? My mother thought about that. Then, after months of the same rounds of questions and answers, she said, Paul isn't your father. In a photo album was a page-sized portrait of a light-skinned Mexican man with wavy hair, a trimmed beard, and the same naive, soft eyes as mine. Who's that? I asked. This is your father, she said, her voice scary in its even-temperedness. He lived here with us for a couple of years when you were a baby. His name was Candido Garcia Ulloa. Was? I think he's dead. He must be dead. Or he went back to Mexico. He was a wetback. He was your father, and he left you. Not her, me. She was quite specific on this point. Does this mean Paul's not my father? I'm not an Indian? Of course you're an Indian. Your name is Brando Skyhorse. Paul is your father because he wants to be your dad. Did Grandma know? Sure, she liked him more than I did. How come nobody told me? Why did you need to know, my mother said. This wasn't any of your business. I'd already given you some fathers. Why did you need any more? Does this mean I'm a Mexican? I raised you as an Indian, not a Mexican. Why, do you want to be a fucking Mexican? So, Candido is my real father? I don't know what real means, she said. Maybe he is, maybe not. I don't want him to be your father, so he might not be. Who knows? But he probably is. Will Candido ever come back? No, he won't. What do I tell people when they ask me what I am? Damn it, don't tell anyone anything, my mother said. You act like a white person telling everyone everything. This is family business, and nobody outside needs to know because they're not family. Try to be more like the mafia, she said. The mafia? What do you mean? Stand by your family and quit being so goddamn honest all the time. Thanks.
Family secrets. My God. So I just started Brando's book. You guys just leave now and go buy it. It's just so damn beautiful and honest and funny and heartbreaking at the same time. And it's an honor to be on the stage with you, sir.
I second that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just jump in where I left off. So I write this accidental memoir. I was not planning to write a memoir. I've written a lot of essays over the years. So I was writing about my sons in baseball. And our sons are really good athletes, and they were playing t-ball and all that stuff. And I learned baseball teaching my sons baseball. I didn't know anything. I was 40 years old, didn't know the first 2 fouls were strikes. I didn't know anything because I'd never played sports. So I start to write an essay that I think will be funny about, I ended up coaching my son's Little League team and didn't know how to play baseball. And I thought, well, that'll be funny, the coach who doesn't know how to play. And 300 pages later, I wrote what I was doing instead of playing organized sports. I was moving 2 to 3 times a year with my single mom for cheaper rent. I was always the new kid. I was a kid who wore glasses and used adverbs in daily speech. So I got brutalized. And for years, I've been wanting to write about violence. I became a fighter and a bit of a vigilante. I despise violence, but I despise cruelty more. And I would go after anyone who hit his wife and put him in the hospital. And I would go after anyone who went after the gay kid and blah, blah, blah. And I got beat up a few times and almost killed a couple of times. My point is, so I write this accidental memoir, I give it to my editor. She says, but didn't you live with people? I say, yeah, but I don't want to violate their privacy. But isn't your mother, your father, your siblings, isn't that part of your life? I said, yeah, but I don't, how do I violate their privacy? So I'll start with that as a question. There was a wonderful, well, I'll just tell you a wonderful bit of advice given to me by Richard Russo, which I'll tell you later. Go ahead.
Well,
Keep you hanging.
we'll put a pin in that.
What's that?
We'll put a pin in that.
Yeah.
That just made me think of this time that, Andre, that you and I were on a panel together. And during the Q&A, somebody who had read Andre's wonderful memoir, Townie, got up and said, basically, in a pretty combative way, what right did you have to tell your brother's story? And Andre said, and I've quoted this many times to students because it was just so powerful and it's such a powerful visual metaphor for kind of what right do we have to tell our stories that involve other people, but we also don't live in a vacuum. You said when I would come home from school to my house that didn't have any parents in it, and was this kind of this place that was a very complicated place to grow up, and I would walk past. So Andre's brother was in a you would call it abusive, right?
Sexually
abusive relationship.
Predatory relationship
with a teacher.
He was a teenager, she was a grown woman.
Right. And so Andre said when I would come home from school and I would hear the sounds coming from behind my brother's closed door, what happened on his side of the door is his story to tell, but what happened to me on my side of the door is mine. Mm. And I just thought that was incredibly powerful because if we're going to write about family, if we're going to write about people we love or people that are dead or people that we have complicated relationships with, we're going to write about our children, we're going to write about our parents who didn't ask for us to write about them. I mean, in my first memoir, in the acknowledgments, I thank my family, and I basically say, no family. It's like, yay, a memoirist has been born into our midst. So I would just start with that, like just what that responsibility is, and I think that the line and not crossing it is different for every writer who writes memoir. Mm.
Yeah, I teach grad students. I'm actually teaching a grad student class in memoir in a couple of days, and those questions always come up. And to me, the thing that I always remind people about memoirs is that memoirs fundamentally, and I've learned this from reading Dani's memoirs and Townie, is that memoir is fundamentally about change. And it's about transformation. It's not meant to be salacious. It's not meant to be, Jerry Springer. Oh, look at the guy who had 5 dads. Look at the guy, it's meant to demonstrate the arc of a journey. I started in this place. I had these experiences. I distilled these experiences, and I learned something from them, and I came out on the other side. And now I want to share what's on that other side for me with anyone who wants to read this book. So again, I think it's just important in terms of centering that, these experiences that all of us have had that we've chosen to distill, for you, the journey becomes complete when you read it. But the whole point is not to say, oh, here's the dirty laundry. It's more like, we had this experience, we lived through it, and maybe you can then take something away from it as a reader.
And Brando, in your beautiful memoir, Take This Man, you talk about, I'm a writer and I write to understand what's happened to me. I think about the word to remember. The opposite is actually not forget. It's it's chop, 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 dismember. So the active memory is reaching for the pieces, reaching for the shards. And as I was writing my way into that accidental memoir of mine, all sorts of dark family shit was coming up, which I remembered it. One of the things I say to memoir writers is, too, yeah, you know what happened, but what the F happened?
Yeah.
And what I was leaving out of my memoir, my editor wanted to know about the family, was, well, my sister was selling drugs, was gang raped by men who were never caught. My brother is being sexually abused for 6 years in our own home by a grown woman. My father was never around. My older sister also bring home drug dealers. It'd be Harley Davidson in front of the house, and my younger sister, only 12 years old, in her Milwaukee brace, put a padlock on her bedroom door because she didn't want to come home to, bikers screwing in her bedroom. And my brother was suicidal, tried to kill himself 10 times. It was a lot of dark, painful stuff. I left it all out, and I have to share with you what Richard Russo, who's an old friend of ours, said, and I'm glad to hear he's coming here next year to talk about the novel. I told him what my editor said. She said, but didn't you live with people? And this is before he wrote his own memoir, Elsewhere, and he gave me the most helpful advice, and if you're writing a memoir or personal essays, I'm going to give it to you because I think it's really helpful. He said, if it were me, I'd ask myself, am I trying to hurt anybody with this book? Am I trying to settle any scores? And he said, if I decided I was, then I wouldn't write it, or I'd write it, but I wouldn't publish it. But if I came to the conclusion, no, I'm not trying to hurt anyone or settle any scores. I'm just trying to go back through the subjective lens of my own memory to try to figure out what the hell happened. And as soon as he said that, I felt so free, because I knew I was angry earlier, but I was turning 50 when I wrote that book. I was no longer mad at my parents. I didn't feel sorry for the kid I'd been. I just felt artistically driven to capture what it was like to be in a mill town in the early 70s, Vietnam limping to a finish, all the daddies gone, all the kids doing drugs and having sex at 11, 12, and 13, and the violence. Lastly, my strategy was, okay, I'm only going to write about my family when their experience intersects mine. So if I'm walking by my brother's room, he's 14, I hear the sounds of sex on the other side. I remember hearing that woman's moans. First, I felt a little jealous, and even though I was sick, I was still a teenager. But I also, the big feeling was relief. Well, if he's doing that, he's going to be too busy doing that to kill himself. And I was relieved he was having sex with his art teacher every day. But I think that's helpful advice from Russo. What do you guys think?
Well, Russo's full of helpful advice.
Yes, he is.
But that's exactly and one of the things I say to my students is, how do you know that you're, well, first of all, writing out of like a desire for revenge, which is what you're talking about. There's so many reasons why that's a bad idea. One of them is that it just doesn't make for good literature. You can smell it. You can just feel it on the page. But the other is, how do you know that you're doing that? I mean, I remember when I wrote my first memoir, Slow Motion, my mother was still living. And in order to be able to tell the story of the loss of my father in a car crash, that my mother was in the car and was very badly injured. I was their only child. It was both the worst thing that had ever happened in my young life and also the thing that saved me, because I was on a very self-destructive spiral. And so I was really trying to interrogate what happens when the worst moment in your life also turns out to be the transformative moment. In order to write that book, I had to include my mother. And I just realized at a certain point that if I could have sent her on a round the world, around the galaxy kind of trip, and everybody who was ever going to read that book would have read it by the time she came back, and she would never have to read it, I would have. I didn't want to hurt her. And so I did give her a copy. I didn't give her a manuscript. I do have another story about that, but I didn't give her a manuscript. I gave her a galley of Slow Motion, so before it came out. And I wondered what was going to happen, because there was a lot in there that was really hard. In fact, this is such a New York Jewish story, so forgive me. My mother's therapist called me.
Is that allowed?
No. And I said, does my mother know that you're calling me? And she said, no. And she asked me if I would come in because she was worried about my mother, and she wanted to talk about her with me. And I thought, wow, this is an incredible opportunity. I can actually bring Slow Motion to this therapist who can read it before my mother so that she can sort of lay the ground for, my mother, she knew I was writing this book, but she didn't know what was exactly what was going to be in it. So I went and I saw the therapist, and, we had that session, and I gave her the book, and over the weekend she read it, and she called me. I still have the notes from that call, because first of all, she started talking about how much she loved the book, and she was giving me her. But then she said, I don't think there's anything that's going to bother your mother in here, nothing at all, except perhaps the part about, what emotional trouble you were in. And I thought, oh, my mother has been wasting so much time and money on this therapist. She absolutely, and then so I did, so I gave my mother the book, and my mother called me when she was about halfway through it, and there was one scene in which from her hospital bed, she was in traction, she had broken many, many broken bones, and she had just lost her husband, and she was suing everyone. She was suing my father's family, she was suing the insurance company, and she was suing the investment bank that my father worked in.
And now she's suing you.
I think she would have eventually if she could have. But she, so there's this scene in which all these people are, and the point is that she's suing all these people from this place of tremendous physical and emotional vulnerability. And my mother called me and she said, I never sued Bear Stearns. So my point being, you actually never know.
You never know
what the thing is that's going to be. Brando, I'm sure you had this, like what the thing is. There are moments where we know, we can feel like, oh, this is going to sting, or we think we know, but we're so often wrong, and then it's something else entirely.
Well, thankfully, I waited until my mother was good and dead for many years before I decided to write and publish this. But you heard in that excerpt, her voice is in my head. It's there. It hasn't gone anywhere. I know that my mother somewhere, if she had had access to the internet, good Lord, catfishing aplenty, she would have been the person that would have left 2 Amazon reviews within 10 minutes of each other. And the first review would have said, 1 star, this book is full of lies, this is completely salacious, my son never talked to me. And then the second review would have been a 5-star review saying, everything in this book is true, and how dare you don't buy my son's book, because he spent years and years working on this. So I guess that would have averaged out to a 3, I don't know, somewhere in between. But there were a couple of my 5 stepfathers I was able to get in touch with the one who wasn't incarcerated. And I'll just let that linger there. And I gave him the pages, and he was actually very, he was like, yeah, everything here that you said about your mom was true, and like, I back it up 100%. But when the stuff came to him, he's like, you put here that I got into Jackson Browne before the Beatles. And it was actually the other way around. So can you talk to your publisher? I know they're Simon & Schuster. Can you drop them a line and let them know that? And I don't remember smoking as much weed as like you've depicted in these pages. It's your story, of course, don't change it. But like, I don't remember just smoking that much marijuana at the time. So I don't know who you might want to talk to. But those things were important to him, those little sort of granular details, as opposed to the big picture stuff.
But thank God they were little.
Yeah, exactly.
I went to my family when I knew that I'd done it all. So after Russo's advice, I wrote a much more honest portrayal of my experience, and which included my mother kind of checking out. All of her family is from South Louisiana, all of my dad. We grew up in New England, where my dad got his first teaching job, and they split up after 9 or 10 years. And our family was just my mother and us 4 kids, and we had no cousins, no uncles, no relatives anywhere except 2,000 miles away. And I tell you that because she did it alone. If I had a foundation, if I had a lot of money, it would be for just one kind of people, and that's single mothers in poverty raising kids alone. That would be my one foundation. So I had to tell her, so I wrote a much more honest portrayal of how she kind of gave up emotionally. It was just like having another sibling in the house. We could drink at 3 in the afternoon, she wouldn't care. We could have sex at age 12 up in the bedroom, she didn't care. It was a wild house. And So now, because I'm an emotional coward, I choose to tell her while we're driving. You talked about confessional booths the other day. I'm driving my truck. We have our coffee. So, Mom, you know, my new book, it looks like it's it's a memoir, honey, I know. And, I try to be really honest. And, there's a part, it's just only like 4 pages, but like try to, I don't want to say like you gave up or anything, but I'm trying to write about, how, She sort of grabs my arm. She says, don't you dare. I'm driving. I go, shit, I already did. Don't you dare not tell your truth, son. You tell your truth. I have mine, you have yours. Don't you worry about me. She said, honey, I'm so old, I don't give a shit what people think about me anyway. Doesn't it make you well?
I love that. I think in a way what we're all sort of illustrating is the way that, we write our way into these stories. And we don't, like I will say to my students sometimes, on the one hand, you know what happened. On the other hand, you're not going into a room by yourself and closing the door for years and writing down what you know.
Right.
Because that would be so boring. And what would be the discovery in that if you're just writing down what you know? And so you're writing into what you don't know with the constraint of, or the parameters of, I'm trying to hew to memory. I am trying to tell my truth, not the truth.
Can I ask you both a question? And we just got the 10-minute sign. Let's involve these people who've all had lives. But what did you learn and what did you learn? Because I've learned a few things from writing that memoir about my life. But how about you? I mean, you've written 5, right? 5 memoirs?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's its own.
Pick one. You want to start with slow motion? You're first? No.
No, I would go straight to inheritance, actually. And what I would say is, I think it's the work of our lives, all of our lives, whether we're writers or not. One of the aspects of sort of becoming mature or an adult is seeing our parents as people, and not as just the folks that are are responsible for our being here and who didn't have lives before we were born and don't have inner lives and rich lives that are aside from our existence. And I had a really hard relationship with my mother, and I had a very profound relationship with my dad, but lost him really young. And so I never really had the opportunity to, to know them as an adult, as all of us being adults. And I was able to find so much compassion for them as who they were before I was born, and to think of them, and this is the last thing I'll say, but there's this ethical term that I learned when I was writing Inheritance, which is retrospective moral judgment. Not judging the past by the standards of the present. And your present and my present of the times that we were writing about were, which is one of the reasons why the relationship between the self and the story, I think, is the story. You decided, like when you wrote your book, it was at a certain point when you were ready to write it. And the same thing for you with Townie, and the same thing for me with each of my memoirs. But that compassion, I would say.
That's a beautiful thing to arrive at.
I think
about
compassion is the key. And I think the idea of like when you share something in a book, it's always amazing to me how people share back, because when I do these readings, and invariably someone will come up to me afterwards and say, hey man, like, are you okay? Like, is everything good in your life? Like, seems kind of intense, lots of crazy stuff happening. But I think that's coming from like a genuine place. And I think when those people reach out and say, are you okay? I think they're also checking in with themselves too. I like to believe that like, anyone who's interested in other people's tea or other people's drama probably has some drama of their own. And I do think that, to me, the physical book it's not just like a container for everything that's happened, but it's the testament, isn't it? It's like we got through it, Not necessarily like in a tidy little bow, but it's done, it's complete, and now it's yours.
I love that, the container. Faulkner's, I'm paraphrasing terribly, but he said the job of the writer is to freeze time so that in 100 years, when the reader reads it, it moves again. Isn't that gorgeous? Yeah. I learned that I was far more hurt by my family's breakup than I ever knew. And I learned I was far more fatherless than I ever thought I was. Like, he didn't abandon us. We saw him. We got child support, not much. he couldn't afford much. We saw him once a week, unlike you and your biological dad. But when I look at, you're talking about themes as obsessions the other day, Dani, and when I look back at my depressing fiction, I seem to always be haunted when I go into the dream world of fiction and novels. I seem to always be haunted how wrongly a life can go, and how things can really fall apart really easily. And I identify with all of us who come from fallen apart places. But yeah, I'm glad I wrote it. A thought, a question, lawsuits. Which can happen when you write a memoir.
We have a question here in the middle.
Hi, thank you all for sharing your stories and your memoirs. I have a question. So I imagine that all three of you must have experienced some kind of identity conflict. Andre, you sound like you really identify with poor, working class, single mothers. Dani, it sounds like your identity might have been shattered when you found out you were only half Jewish, and you realized who your real biological father was. And Brando, for you, you were kind of brought up with these two minority identities, Native American and then Mexican, and so I was just wondering, what kind of identity conflicts, if any, that you all experience? Thank you.
Good question. Dani?
When I started to write Inheritance, I realized that what was most universal about my experience, because I was trying to find what was universal about it because it felt so bananas to me, was, there was one of the spiritual thinkers that I consulted at one point said, everyone feels other. And I said, really, everyone? He said, yeah, smart people. He said, everyone feels other. You have gone to the front of otherness, and you're coming back with something to share. And that, for me, I think I don't know about you guys, but I feel like for me, my identity is, I build it word by word on the page in some way. You say, yes, in one way my identity was shattered, but in another way, the great privilege of being able to be a writer and to sort of interrogate those questions and what does this mean, and what do I do with it, and who am I in relation to all these people who came before me and to my own history. That for me is like putting myself back together again.
Yeah, over and over.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really wonderful question. I've realized as I've started to tell my story that there are a lot of people whose parents passed them as other ethnicities, particularly American Indians. I don't know why that was a thing. Maybe it was the 1970s. I can't really speak to that. But I think that having empathy for my mother, and in her mind, what she was doing wasn't meant to harm me, I don't think. I think she was trying to protect me. I think she was trying to give me something that she thought would serve me somewhere down the road. And if that sounds a little like therapy speak talking to you, it probably is, because I've had to also do a lot of work and just reflection of okay, so what does it mean to say, I am this, I am that? Because when you have a name like Brando Skyhorse, you better bloody believe you get asked that all the time. And if you don't have a pat answer or a really good sense of humor, you're gonna get into a lot of arguments. You're gonna get into a lot of disagreements. So I think that finding a way to kind of come to some sort of peace with myself and with her decision. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there was that woman, Rachel Dolezal, who passed herself as African American. Yeah. And I remember there was a lot of dogpiling on her. And to me, I felt this overwhelming sense of empathy, because I was like, my God, that's my mother.
Oh, beautiful. Wow. I'm the son of a great writer with the same name, which is the pain in the ass for 30 years, but it's gotten better lately. And he was a short story master, and he would write at the height of his powers in really his 40s and early 50s, he'd write 3 masterpieces a year, and he'd mimeograph the pages and inscribe them to each of us kids. And so I've published 9 books, and not one of my books is signed to any of our 3 kids. And my daughter, Ariadne, who's getting a PhD in feminist philosophy, said, Dad, what the F? You're going to die. Can you sign my book? And I said, why haven't I signed their books? And I realized that I don't want them to give a shit what I do for a living. I'm their father. And one of the things that I discovered writing these essays in Ghost Dogs is I identify as a father and then a husband, and writer is a distant third. And I would rather die an attentive, loving father and a husband than be known as a writer for the rest of my days. But writing about broken families and my own beautiful, unbroken family, thank God, has reinforced that. You guys, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.